Hello and welcome to this tutorial on the RFT-CBS framework focused on the different types of relational framing and their use in therapy. So this tutorial is adapted from the fourth part of Chapter 3 in Mastering the Clinical Conversation, Language as Intervention, and you can find other resources on the clinical applications of RFT at languageasintervention.com. So let's first refresh our memory by quickly reviewing the framework of psychotherapy based on CBS RFT. So we have two overarching goals, shaping flexible context sensitivity and shaping functional coherence. And we have one overarching strategy, which is transforming symbolic functions by altering the context. Now what we are going to explore is how we can alter the context with language in therapy. As you may remember from previous tutorials, RFT defines language as the behavior of building and responding to symbolic relations among things and events. We call this behavior framing, and we use sometimes the term frame to talk about an instance of framing, just like we talk about a thought as an instance of thinking, or walk as an instance of walking, and so on. There are different types of frames, and they can alter the context in different ways, which can lead to different transformation of functions. Metaphorically, it's like looking at this picture here and putting different frames around. If you put a window frame, you might begin to interact with this picture by thinking of the beautiful landscape that's in front of the house and perhaps getting prepared for a walk in the mountains. If you put this antique gold frame, you might look at it as a piece of art. And if you put these theater curtains around, you might look at the picture as the background of something happening in front. So different frames alter the context in different ways and influence the way you interact with the picture. This is exactly what happens with language. The way we relate things and events influences the way we see things and events and the way we respond to them. Now we are going to review some main types of frames that we can use in our language and some of their clinical applications. To remind us that a frame is not a thing, but a behavior, the behavior of relating, I will generally use the term framing. The simplest kinds of relational framings are coordination and distinction. I represent them here by the equal or different signs. The two black dots are the same and the white dot is different than the black dots. For example, coordination framing is present in the sentence, I am stupid. The word am is the contextual cue that connects I and stupid and put them in a relation of coordination. If I say I am not stupid, then am and not are the contextual cues indicating that I and stupid are different from each other. These types of relational framings will be particularly useful for noticing and describing. It is crucial in experiential therapy because we want to help clients better notice what happens so that they can adapt their behavior more effectively to different contexts instead of persisting in actions that don't work or are harmful. Note that coordination, which conveys the sense of coming together, actually includes subcategories like equivalence, as for the equal sign here, but also similarity, association, etc. Opposition framing is a subcategory of distinction framing. It means that two things are not only different but opposite. I made a specific slide for this one, even if it's a subcategory of distinction, because we often use it specifically in therapy. For example, when exploring meaningful purposes, to a client who says, I don't want to be alone, a therapist might ask, what would your life be like if you were with someone instead? This is a typical move that helps explore values when psychological pain is taking all the space. Along the same lines, a therapist might ask a client to explore sources of motivation for a given action if no external reinforcers, such as social approval, were provided. It's a way of conducting a thought experiment which changes the context, at least virtually, and helps the client explore new contingencies in the context. Conditional framing is crucial to evaluate effectiveness, in particular to notice the impact of behaviors or to identify which behavior can help reach a given goal. For example, asking, what could you do to get closer to your children? Will likely lead the client to explore what needs to happen in order to get there. a bit like if she was solving an equation. Conditional framing is also useful to track contingencies, such as relationships between antecedents and responses, and between responses and consequences. A therapist might, for example, ask, what happens if you drink alcohol when you are anxious? Conditional framing can also be useful to normalize or validate the client's experience, for example, by acknowledging the impact of contextual variables on the client's feelings, thoughts, and actions. A therapist could say, for instance, given your history, it makes sense that you have this emotional reaction. Notice how conditional framing is at the core of flexible context sensitivity and functional coherence because it helps notice the impact of antecedents and consequences and assess the effectiveness of a response. Comparison framing is useful to notice and describe with precision because comparison is at the core of quantification. So, beyond naming, we can also measure experiences. For example, a therapist might invite a client to compare sensations or to determine the degree of believability in a thought. Comparison framing is also useful to evaluate the effectiveness of alternative responses, as when reviewing the pros and cons of changing in motivational interviewing, or the consistency of an action with values in ACT by asking, was this action more a toward or an away move? It's also helpful to track contingencies, for example, by comparing the level of an emotion before and after an emotion regulation strategy. Deictic framing is the type of framing involved in perspective taking. It is useful for a lot of therapeutic techniques. We can use it for noticing, because when we change perspective, we often see things that we didn't see before. For example, a therapist might invite a client to imagine observing his own behavior from the perspective of his partner. Deictic framing also helps create distance, because we can put experiences a little farther and decrease their influence on our behaviors. That's what we do when we have clients write thoughts on a sheet of paper, for example. We also use perspective taking for normalizing and validating emotions, thoughts, and sensations, and for compassion. For example, by inviting a client to take the perspective of someone who is usually kind toward them as a way of increasing kindness toward themselves. It's also useful to build a flexible and stable sense of self, because it helps connect with the part of ourselves that transcends our actions, roles, and thoughts. We will talk about these points in more details in other tutorials. Hierarchical framing is useful to label or categorize psychological experiences, which will lead to change their influence on the client's behavior. For example, recognizing that your heart beating fast is an emotion can help accepting it if you thought before that it was a sign of a heart attack. Two areas where hierarchical framing is crucial is for building a flexible sense of self, because it helps integrate all psychological experiences into a context. A very simple example of this process is when we use the phrase, you have the thoughts that. It's a way of shaping a relation of inclusion rather than coordination between the thought and the self. Hierarchical framing is also crucial for building meaning and motivation, because it is what allows us to connect actions to higher purposes, as when we choose actions that contribute to a value. Framings can also be combined to form metaphors, stories, rules, and instructions. Metaphors are used to help clients look at their situation in a different way and apply things they know from a different context to this situation. For example, in the classic quicksand metaphor, a client is led to explore the counterproductive effects of emotional avoidance through the observation that trying to escape quicksand will make you sink even more. Stories can have inspirational effects, and rules and instructions are often used in psychoeducation and exercises. Gestures and postures often have a symbolic meaning through the same process as in metaphors. There is a kind of parallel between two situations that share a common set of relationships. For example, leaning forward can be a symbol of increased intimacy. Moving hands from the left to the right can underline the temporal relationship between an antecedent and a response. Finally, the connections between what happens in therapy and what happens in the client's life outside can be made by drawing out analogies between the here and now and the there and then. For example, a therapist might ask, "What you're feeling in reaction to my question, is it similar to what you feel when your wife criticizes you?" These kinds of inside-outside connections contribute to the symbolic generalization of behaviors shaped in therapy. So let's summarize the RFT framework to use language in therapy. We have two overarching goals: flexible context sensitivity and functional coherence, and an overarching strategy: transforming symbolic functions by altering the context. Then we have the concrete tools of language, made of different types of framings and combinations of framings. Using the different types of framings alters the context in different ways and can lead to different types of transformations of functions. To finish this section on the types of relational framings, I would like to review a couple of points that are important to keep in mind when using relational framing in clinical practice. First, we need to consider the degree of precision that is useful when identifying types of framing. Technically, in each sentence, we could find dozens of framings since each word is already in a frame of coordination with the thing it refers to. And then there are many relations among the words themselves. But using RFT in therapy doesn't require thinking at this level of precision. It's not possible to have a conversation with the client and to identify in the moment all these types of framing. In addition, all the types of framings involved in a sentence are not critical to the clinical intervention. For example, if I ask a client, "What would you think if you looked at this situation from my point of view?" It's more practical to think of this question as a perspective-taking or Deictic framing move than to analyze each bit of the question to say that I used conditional, coordination, spatial framing, and so on. What we are interested in is the type of framing that is most critical to produce the appropriate transformation of function. So, for practical reasons, we will rarely talk about more than a couple of framings per turn of speech. Another important point is to remember the difference between topography and function when using different types of relational framings. In the examples of each type of framings I gave earlier, I used some typical formulations that generally function for the listener as intended by the speaker. For example, when I say "this is a cat," it's unlikely that you derive that "this" and "cat" are in relations of condition or opposition, because the word "is" commonly cues coordination framing. But technically, any word, sound, picture, or stimulus in general could have the function of cueing any kind of framing. So don't be too attached to specific formulations. What matters is the impact that your language will have on the client's response. I like to illustrate this idea with the example of using the back of a screwdriver as a hammer. It's not meant for it, but it can function that way. So I can use different kinds of symbols to cue a same kind of framing, and the same symbol can cue different kinds of framings. Finally, it's important to differentiate the therapist framing from the client's framing. When the therapist talks to the client, he uses different kinds of framings, hoping to shape the client's own framing. For example, the therapist might ask, "What happens as a result of staying in bed all day?" which is a conditional framing move aimed at shaping the client's awareness of a consequence. The client also needs to engage in conditional framing, even if he is not formulating it out loud. For example, he might just say, "I feel more depressed," which is a result of deriving a relation of condition between staying in bed and the consequence of staying in bed. So in this case, the therapist used conditional framing and the client likely derived conditional framing too. But the therapist could use a different type of framing in order to help the client become aware of the consequence of staying in bed. For example, he could say, "Imagine a day when you stayed in bed the whole time. Now picture in your mind the situation at the end of the day and how you feel, just as if you were there. How do you feel then?" So this formulation is better defined as a Deictic framing or perspective-taking move, and yet the client is still led to notice the consequence of staying in bed all day, and thus conditional framing is shaped too. So the core idea to remember here is that there are multiple ways to shape the client's framing. We don't have to use the same kind of framing that we would like the client to develop. Another implication of this observation, and of the previous observation about the distinction between topography and function, is that we can never be 100% sure that the cues we use, generally words, to apply different types of framing mean the same things to the client. For one word use, we need to take into account the history of learning of the client and the history of learning of the therapist. Fortunately, they generally share a common language, or else they wouldn't be able to communicate at all. But it's not uncommon to observe misunderstandings in session because what is said by the therapist is not understood the same way by the client, and vice versa. When the misunderstanding is obvious, it's not too much of a problem, because then we generally work on clarifying what is meant. But when we don't immediately catch the discrepancy between what is meant and what is understood, it can lead to more difficulties. So, my advice is to keep in mind that symbols are not meaningful in and of themselves. Their meaning depends on how we have been shaped to interpret them. And it's often a good idea to check with the client if we understand what they say and if they understand what we say. We will come back to this point in more detail later when talking about specific interventions. Here is a summary of the main points you've learned in this tutorial and that I would like you to remember. Relational framings are symbolic tools that allow us to alter the context and transform functions with language. There are different types of framings, among which coordination, distinction, opposition, condition, comparison, hierarchy, deictic, and combination of framings. Each type of framing can alter the context in a different way and lead to different transformations of functions. To identify the types of framing involved in a therapeutic intervention, we generally limit our analysis to the main framings responsible for the critical transformation of function. Different topographies of framing can have the same function, and similar topographies can have different functions. In a clinical conversation, we need to consider the history of learning of both the client and the therapist, because the same symbol might mean different things based on these different histories. And this is the end of this tutorial on the different types of relational framing and their use in therapy. This tutorial was adapted from the fourth part of Chapter 3 in Mastering the Clinical Conversation, Language as Intervention. If you want to watch the next tutorial on psychological assessment, focused on creating an experiential context for assessment and assessing context sensitivity, you can go to languageasintervention.com. You will also find other resources on the applications of RFT for clinical practice.